Dungeon Intimacies, The Poetics of Transsexual Sadomasochism by Susan Stryker. Site Survey. From Bernal Heights, the city of San Francisco spreads north and west, a slow-moving accretion in steel and glass, brick and concrete, of the human desire unleashed and focused upon this terrain by the gold rush of 1848, an alchemical transformation of precious metal into philosopher's stone, upon which I sit and think. Ian sits behind me on the grassy slope, her fingers anchored into my shoulders, her thumb expertly digging at the lump of knotted muscle between shoulder blade and spine, where my keystroking and mousing actions accumulate. We've scarcely seen each other over these past 15 years, and never known each other well, in the ways that conventionally count as knowing someone well. But since she's been back, we've fallen into a practical familiarity with one another's bodies, rooted in our shared history of a particular subculture, at a particular place and time that I think of as our dungeon intimacy. The physical landscape is made of memories. Over there, to the right, a few hundred feet away, Dell shot Cooper for the cover of the Drag King book. Extending my line of sight past that point, toward the city's eastern bay shore, I see the place by the abandoned steel foundry, where Texas Tomboy and Monica Trout filmed some scenes for Gender Knots. Turning my head counterclockwise, I see the live-work lofts near the Bay Bridge, where Ian and I once watched Raylan pierce and cut Kathy Opie for one of her bloody self-portraits. There's my house, down at the foot of Bernal Hill, where my partner and I now live. Ian, after years in New York, now lives with her family over there in Martin, north across the Golden Gate. We point out to each other various places we've each lived since the 1980s, around Berkeley and Oakland in the East Bay, Potrero Hill, and half a dozen places in the Mission District here in the city. She says she sat in this very spot before, smoking pot with our friend Edward, back when she helped him run the Lynx S&M play parties, which I attended regularly for several years. Off in the middle distance, west of downtown and south of Market Street, stands a large brick building, a fortress really, built in Moorish revival style, complete with crenellated turrets and deeply recessed apertures in the thick walls, from which cannons and rifles could be fired. It is the old San Francisco National Guard Armory on Mission Street at 14th. We are both historians, Ian and I, who have been taught to encounter the space around us in 4 dimensions, extending our observations into patterns longer than our lived experience. There is Mission Dolores, established by Spanish priests in 1776, and its counterpart, the Presidio, a garrison farther to the west, near the mouth of the bay where the ships come in from the sea. Together they formed the original instruments of California's conquest and colonization, one housing church and the other army. Behind us, at the crest of Bernal Hill, is a small military telecommunications facility, a nondescript little cinder-block building sprouting metal appurtenances, humming low behind a chain-link fence and padlock gate. It forms part of the current martial occupation and organization of the space we now inhabit. The armory occupies an intermediate time-space, framed and inflected by these maximal and minimal fixed points in temporal distance within the present built environment. It is the materialized remnant of its own distinctive meshwork of force relations, its own constitutive logics of movement, investment, and territory. Constructed in the years just prior to World War I, the structure addressed itself to the labor upheavals of late 19th century 1800s industrial capitalism, to a tradition of urban mass protests, and to lingering memories of civil war. In housing troops and weapons whose function was to suppress popular insurrection and maintain government control over city streets, the armory enacted a shift in military attention. Management of domestic populations supplanted the threat of coastal invasion. Its massive battlements point back in time toward the Presidio, but its placement in the mixed residential commercial working-class neighborhood surrounding Mission Dolores anticipated the contemporary biopolitical surveillance state. A block and a half up 14th Street from the Armory is the House of the Golden Bull, where the Lynx play parties took place starting in 1989. The Armory itself had been vacant since 1976, and its state of disrepair mirrored the surrounding neighborhood. Multi-story houses built for multi-generational families around the turn of the last century had gone derelict in the post-World War II flight to the suburbs, and some, like the Golden Bull, had been snatched up by gay men with an eye for abandoned architecture. The Mission District abutted the homocentric Castro neighborhood and functioned, in its northwesterly extremes, as a spillover zone for populations marginal to the gay male society that had rooted there in the 1960s. A women's enclave had formed in the Mission in the 1970s, a few blocks southeast of the Armory, around Valencia Street between 18th and 22nd, while the epicenter of the city's leather scene had been on the Armory's northern side, in the south of Market District along Folsom Street's Miracle Mile. Competition for land closer to downtown had driven the leather zone southwesterly toward the Mission for 3 decades. By the early 1990s. The Catacombs, one of the city's most storied dungeon spaces, had been located a few blocks south of the Armory on Shotwell at 17th. The Catacombs set in closure in 1989 contributed to the rise of the Golden Bowl as the S&M party venue. The Golden Bowl occupied the geographical margins of 3 urban zones, each characterized by distinct sexual subcultural formations and social movements: homosexuality and gay liberation, the women's movement and lesbian feminism, and the ars erotica of consensual sadomasochism. The property valuations of its physical site reflected the fallowness of its location in the overarching ecology of the city. The view from the back deck overlooked a disintegrating public housing project. Its immediate neighbors were an edgy gay-owned art gallery, the Dyke Run Black and Blue Tattoo, and the Bearded Lady Truck Stop Cafe, where underground performance artist Harriet Dodge and the lesbian punk band Tribe 8 held court. Pioneers of the pierced and tatted subcultural aesthetic shared street space, and sometimes substance abuse habits and job descriptions, with the neighborhood's many junkies and sex workers. The Lynx parties occupied a slice of time as precisely cited as their real estate. The AIDS pandemic was in full swing in those years before the antiviral cocktails, and S&M seemed situated at the very crux of the crisis. Its precepts of negotiation and consent, its panoply of techniques for eliciting bodily sensation without exchanging bodily fluids, its meticulous disarticulations of erotics from genital sexuality, all promised a viable future. It was to such dungeons such as the Golden Bowl that Michel Foucault referred when he noted that you find emerging in places like San Francisco and New York what might be called laboratories of sexual experimentation. The dungeon, I'll suggest, in the pages that follow, is indeed just such a productive and transformative space as a laboratory, a space not merely for the discovery of an existing objective world, but a playground, workshop, or place of study that is in fact a generative space, one facilitative of the materialization of creatively grasped virtualities. It is place as process, or, in Geography Doreen Massey's words, place as a distinctive mixture, gathering, and manifestation of local and global social, economic, and communications relations that knot themselves up together for a length of time, and which become concretized in the objects that collectively constitute their place by assembling there. Judith Halberstam points out that Massey offers to queer theorists of embodiment, sexuality, and gender an alternative to the views of other postmodern geographers, such as Dennis Harvey and Edward Soya, who privilege the global and distrust the local as place-bound, reactionary, and potentially fascist in its parochial distance from all things cosmopolitan. No place can be more local than the body, within systems of thought which have a vested interest in ignoring the inescapable fact that even the most global analysis is tied to the particular, raced, sexed, classed, educated body of the analyst who conceives it, because not to do so would unmask its enabling privileges. No place is shunted to the periphery of consideration with greater alacrity than is the body. Reconceptualizing every place, including the lived space of the body, as a glocal hybrid, opens an important line of critical inquiry. As sociologist Avery Gordon points out, we have become adept at discovering the construction of social realities and deconstructing their architecture, but in telling the stories of these realities, we have not yet taken as seriously as we should the insight that the intricate web of connections that characterize any event or problem is the story. Transsexual sadomasochism incarnates the processes within and through which the body materializes the specificity of its location, installing the body that practices it as a place, one as contingent, situated, and real as any armory or repurposed Victorian house. In offering this autoethnographic account of embodied knowledges and knowledges of embodiment, produced in a particular dungeon space, neighborhood, and historical moment, through my own past experiences of transsexual sadomasochism, my intent is not to attribute any particular importance to certain events simply because I, rather than someone else, participated in them. The goal, rather, is to open a critical space within which subjectively perceived phenomenological experiences can offer evidence for more widely applicable statements about the relationship between embodied subject and material environment. I offer these observations in the spirit of pornosophy, Shannon Bell's adept coinage for the militant insistence on an epistemic parity between the disparate knowledges of the scientist, the philosopher, and the whore, and as a refusal to discredit what our own carnality can teach us. Topoanalysis and rhythmoanalysis. Transsexual sadomasochism in dungeon space enacts a poiesis, an act of artistic creation, that collapses the boundary between the embodied self, its world, and others, allowing one to interpenetrate the others and thereby constitute a specific place. It gestures toward the metaphysical counterscheme that haunts the margins of Western dualistic thought, wherein the duality of subject and object, in the words of philosopher of science Gaston Bachelard, becomes iridescent, shimmering, unceasingly active in its inversions. We are the diagrams of the functions of inhabiting the spaces where we have lived intimately, Bachelard writes in The Poetics of Space, his classic work on the experience of inhabiting the felicitous spaces we designate with concepts of home. The word habit is too worn a word to express this passionate liaison of our bodies, which do not forget, with these unforgettable spaces of our inhabitation. Bachelard calls for a twofold approach to spatial poetics, a topoanalysis, conceived as an auxiliary to psychoanalysis that offers a systematic psychological study of the sites of our intimate lives, and its complement, a rhythmoanalysis, that accounts for the reiterative temporal practices, habitual movements, through which we inhabit those sites. He is particularly concerned with the fluctuating movement between the real and the unreal, whose dynamic interlacings produce the shimmering iridescence of poetic reverie, or common daydreaming. Bachelard shares with his psychoanalytic contemporaries Laplanche and Pontalis a concept of fantasy as inhabited structure and of structure as inhabited fantasy. Space, as he conceives it, is simultaneously phantasmatic and material, furnishable with various contents both psychical and tangible, and within which it is possible to change positions as one would move about a house. 100 people or more might pack the Golden Bowl for a well-attended Lynx party. One could not enter without an invitation. On party nights, one approached the grated street-level door, where a monitor checked the name you gave against the RSVP list. One then proceeded up a flight of stairs and through another door to an anteroom off the entrance hall, where one paid the cover charge, checked one's coat, and, if need be, changed one's clothes. One then passed through a kitchen and living room out to the deck, where one set of stairs led up to the owner's private floor, and another set led down to the labyrinthine dungeon. One room held a waterbed, another a jail cell, and yet others mattresses, racks, crosses, ropeworks, and suspension hooks, with conveniently situated hardware screwed into the walls and ceilings. A bathroom was reserved for piss play, scat, and blood sports. Sharps containers emblazoned with biohazard warning labels were placed in visible locations in every room, as were copious amounts of condoms and lube. Safety monitors kept an eye out for trouble, and medical care providers were on site in case of emergency. Drugs and alcohol were not allowed. Mirrors and day-glow graffiti covered the unfurnished dry walls. It was there in the dungeon that I first met Ian, sometime around 1991. Coupling, though tolerated with a certain libertarian aplomb, was not the dominant mode of interpersonal relationship in the dungeon. The general ethos of the space favored a respectful openness to spontaneous liaisons, improvised orchestrations, and serendipitous multiplicities. Like a cocktail party without drinks, where the conversations were pantomimed in leather, or a jam session around the edges of which a solo jazz musician might hover before joining in. This made the dungeon a welcoming and convivial place, where one was encouraged to encounter fellow creatures with a sense of wonder and curiosity, with patience rather than judgment. Every person became for others a unique opportunity for the universe to reveal itself from a slightly different perspective, and some of the views were stunning.